Okay, hello students. So, as always, this is a supplement to in-class instruction or activities. Due to YouTube's policies, some topics and images are removed from these presentations. And again, this is a supplement to what we do in class. This is also a gross oversimplification of a really complicated time period. There are entire college courses that can be about this one specific chapter. So this is a gross oversimplification. Your book will have more information, etc., etc. So what are we learning? So what we're going to be looking at in this chapter is that what's going to happen to the United States post-War of 1812. So the War of 1812, sometimes called the Second War of American Independence, is really going to lead to some cultural changes in America. And we're going to look at some of those economic and cultural changes. And then there's going to be this debate over as the national government gets bigger and stronger, the question is, should it get bigger and stronger? So if we're going to improve and modernize as a country, who should pay for that? And it's not immediately obvious, and it's also not in the Constitution, which is going to lead to some questions. And then finally, there's going to be something known as the Second Great Awakening, and this is probably one of the biggest points of this chapter, in this idea of perhaps we should try as a society to grow more intentionally. So we're going to see how this all plays out. Let's go ahead and dive in. I like to call this the meanwhile unit. And what I mean by that is that we're going to go kind of free from time here. I'd like to tell this story usually pretty chronologically, but I'm not going to for this next unit. We're going to be in this amorphous period between 1800 and 1860, and we're going to talk about some events, and then we'll go back and go through the history of what's happening like politically with the presidency, but this is happening in the background of the story. Because what we're going to be talking about is something known as world building. So world building is this concept of literally building the world that the story is being set in. So think of Star Wars. Okay, well, we got to talk about everything that's going beyond what we just see in the films, right? So who are the Jedi? Who are the Sith? Who built the Death Star? Stuff like that, right? So this is kind of what we're going to be doing in this chapter is we're going to be world building and filling in the details of the United States. It's the kind of thing that a lot of people don't really find all that interesting sometimes. Like some people just want to watch the flashy Marvel films and who cares about like how Iron Man does whatever Iron Man does. But some people want to read the 75 comic book issues that explain how Iron Man does things. In this chapter, we're going to have to be like that. Okay, so it all starts with something called the market economy or the market revolution. These things kind of go together. What this means here is that it's basically another way of looking at like the first industrial revolution in a way for the Americans. Before this time period, basically every product was made by the family unit itself. So if you needed a t-shirt, for example, that would have to be made on your farm by you. Or more accurately, there's going to be this division of labor, men versus women labor. We've talked about this before. So what starts to happen in the market economy is that people are going to start specializing in something. So for example, let's just say that your friend makes the best t-shirts in the community. Okay, well, what you're going to do is you're going to say, hey, look, rather than me make a t-shirt that sucks, how about you make the t-shirt for the whole community? And that's all you're going to do now. And the rest of us will trade with you. And that's essentially how the market economy takes off. We allow certain people to specialize in what they're good at, and then they don't need to do everything anymore. And the advent of things like machines are going to help that really blossom and grow. So we call this a market economy. And the idea of a market economy is that uh, an economy is based off of making and buying goods and services rather than like every single person being a self-sufficient subsistence farmer. Now people are going to specialize in things. Again, this seems really obvious to you because this is kind of the origin story of the world you live in now. I'm going to go ahead and guess none of you farmed anything you've ever eaten. So this is kind of how that gets started. Now, what's going to happen here is that America is essentially going to go through an industrial revolution. And in my mind, I can think of several reasons as to why this happens. So why does the United States go through a early industrial revolution? So the first one here is that the Embargo Act is going to force the United States to industrialize. Roll back to the last chapter, right? We have this Embargo Act meaning that we can't trade with Europe. So if we need something to exist, we have to make it ourselves. So that's going to force us to make things that we had previously purchased from Europe. Next, number two, we get to copy and steal ideas from Europe. So a reason why America industrializes is that we get to kind of see what works in Europe and copy that, as opposed to trying to do everything on our own. The best way to think about this is that it turns out your cell phone will probably work better in sub-Saharan Africa than it does here in Southern California. How is that possible? Well, it's because in sub-Saharan Africa, when they first build infrastructure, they get to build it starting with 5G. Meanwhile, here in Southern California, we still have all of these old networks and old towers that have to be upgraded, and that takes time and money. Whereas when it's built the first time in sub-Saharan Africa, they get to start with the best technology available. We get to do the same thing, and that's going to lead to faster advancements. Number three, we have a lot of economic advantages. So the United States has basically any resource you could ever possibly need for any business. You need water, we got it. You need lumber, we got it. You need coal, we got it. Soon you need child laborers, we're gonna have those, no problem. Um, so that's whatever resource you need, we've got in spades. Number four, the economic cycle. This one's a little bit more amorphous, but the basic idea here is the reason why industrialization happens is because industrialization is popular. Turns out people like to have better made products than something they could make themselves, and they like to not have to do something. Like, I enjoy being able to purchase the same 5 shirts that I wear all school year, as opposed to having to make them myself. If I made them myself, they'd probably look significantly worse. So why should I make them? And this idea becomes popular. It's like when Amazon first started, hardly anybody used it. And then they realized, wow, this is so much more convenient. And that's why it now controls everything. I'm assuming this is probably hosted on some Amazon server as we speak. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the reason why the economy changes during this time period is because the government doesn't get in the way. Okay, so the word we're going to learn here is called a regulation. A government regulation is a rule they put on a business, usually to make something safer. During this time period, none of those exist. There are no government regulations. You want to hire a 5-year-old kid to put their arm in between some like gears in your machine? Knock yourself out. You want to make workers work 14 hours a day and you want to pay women 10 cents an hour? Knock yourself out. There are no rules to the game. And when there are no rules to the game, businesses prosper. Now, we'll learn in a later chapter that there's going to be a pretty serious cost to this. But for now, that's part of why businesses take off. Again, there'll be a cost later, but for now, let's make things happy and say that it's cool that we're going to have children as laborers. Okay, so we had a market revolution, and now we got to move that stuff around. Here it comes. This is the kind of thing that Mullen gets very excited about that no one else cares about. I love infrastructure and I love transportation developments. I could talk about this stuff all day. We'll see how long this slide takes to get through. Okay, so now that we're making stuff, how do we transport this stuff across the country? By the way, my dog says hi, so she's currently trying to get my attention as I'm trying to talk to you guys. So it's a little distracting. And now she's licking my hand. So everyone say hi to my dog Gidget. Okay, so I should probably include a picture of her in this somewhere, but it's too late now. I've already started. Oh well. Okay, so the transportation revolution. Now that we can make stuff, how do we move it? Well, we're going to do it by building something called infrastructure. So infrastructure is basically everything around you. How did you get to school today? Or you're probably watching this at home. So how would you get to school? Well, you'd take a road. Who built that road? That is infrastructure, right? So infrastructure is how we move people, places, or people and things, I should say, to different places. How did we build the 10, the 210, all that kind of stuff? That's infrastructure. So the United States needs to build infrastructure. Before we start doing this, we basically have a bunch of like Native American and wild game trails across the country. Like that's how we get places. And I'm going to go ahead and guess none of you took a Native American trail to get to school this week. So we got to build some other stuff. The very first thing that we build is something called turnpikes. So a turnpike is essentially a fancy way of saying a toll road. A toll road being like a road that you have to pay to use. So it's basically a graded road, which made it a lot faster to go, especially if you like think of it this way. If you're trying to travel, I don't know, up Mount Baldy, is it faster to drive your car up Baldy Road, or is it faster to walk up and over Potato Mountain, up and over Sunset Peak, and then up to Baldy? Obviously, it's significantly faster to take the road. That's a turnpike. Okay, the next big idea is going to be this thing known as a canal. So a canal, which may possibly be on the next slide, I don't know, but a canal is think of it as something as a waterway that links two bodies of water. So think of it like a street, but of water. So if we're going to connect two rivers together, this might come as a shock to you because you're in Southern California, but if you were to live on the East Coast, there's water like everywhere. And it's significantly easier to transport goods over water. Even today, as of 2025, when I'm recording this, most of the items that we ship are transported by ocean liners. So it's easier to carry freight on water than it is over land, always. So as many Amazon delivery trucks and semi-trucks that you guys see every day, there's significantly more ships carrying significantly more weight. It's easier. So the East Coast has a bunch of available water. What they need is that water to connect to itself. And by doing this, they're going to dig a bunch of holes and fill those with water. They're called canals. They're all over the place on the East Coast. The biggest and largest of these canals is going to be something known as the Erie Canal. This is going to connect Lake Erie to to New York City. So the Erie Canal is actually ironically more than one canal, but it's going to be a network of canals that's going to connect New York City to the Great Lakes. And the reason why that is significant is because all of the Great Lakes connect to each other, and once they build the Illinois Canal, which is going to connect to the Illinois River, the Illinois River connects to the Mississippi River. So by building the Erie Canal, we're able to take all of the stuff that we're building, like in New York and all those factories, and ship it to almost anywhere in the country. It's pretty impressive, and it's going to revolutionize American businesses and American trade. And the reverse is also true. When the Erie Canal is open, we're able to take all of the stuff that is farmed in the Midwest along the Mississippi River and send that into New York. So that's going to kind of revolutionize this sectional change that we're having, where the Northeast is going to be big on building infrastructure in cities and stuff, whereas the Midwest and the South are going to be mainly agricultural. We're able to do this because of canals. Life also gets easier when you add in my boy Robert Fulton and his invention known as the steamboat. What makes the steamboat so interesting is that it's a machine that essentially uses steam power to move a ship upstream against the current. So this is going to revolutionize things as you can possibly imagine, because it makes it easier to go not just down the Mississippi River, but back up the Mississippi River. If we're transporting goods, that's going to make life easier. Hey, look, here's a map to explain what I'm talking about. So this is what's known as a hydrology map. And what you can see here, especially on the East Coast, they have a ton of rivers. And if we can connect these rivers together with canals, we can go pretty much anywhere. By the way, look at the West Coast. All of the water that you use probably comes out of the Colorado River. See how small and piddly that river is in comparison to the Mississippi? If we had the outflow of the Mississippi River for like a week, Southern California would never have a drought again. It's crazy how much water comes out of the Mississippi. Like the water from 31 states drains out of it. It's insane. But if we can figure out how to use canals and steamboats to be able to go up and down that river, I mean, really, with the Erie Canal and with this river network, we're technically able, I mean, not in 1825, but eventually we would be able to get a good on a ship in New York and have that good travel all the way to Montana by boat. That's pretty crazy. Here's another example of the Erie Canal. Again, you can see the canal cutting across New York and getting into Lake Erie. So that's the significance of that. Now you can see it. Now, that's all fine and good, but what happens if you don't live by water? Well, the most significant invention during this time period is going to be something known as the railroad. The railroad's going to be in the back of our story really throughout the entire 1800s, and we're going to mention it here or and there as we go. But as important as the internet and cell phones are to the current decade, century that we are in, as I'm recording this, it's 2025, that is as significant as the railroad is to the 1800s. The biggest and most powerful businesses are going to be involved in the railroad. Pretty much every product, if it's not transported by water, is going to be transported by railroad. And often it will take the railroad to get to water. So think of the railroad network that we're going to be building during this chapter as the start of the entire basis of the American economy. Just like how everything today runs off of the internet, everything back then ran off of the railroad. It's the biggest, most powerful business. And this is really going to lead to a lot of growth and changes during this time period with the economy. Um, Railroads are cheap to build, trains can travel relatively quickly, and they're going to be able to go more places than boats during this time period. The issue here, and actually it's the issue of this entire chapter so far, is who's going to pay to build all this infrastructure? Should the national government pay to build this, or should the states? And this is going to be a fight that's going to happen a lot throughout this chapter, and really throughout the rest of the 1800s, the 1900s, and even to today. Who should pay for this infrastructure that we all like to have? You took a road to get to school this week. Who paid for that road? Was it a business that paid for it? Was it the city? Was it the state? Was it the national government? And the answer is it really could be all four. And that's going to be kind of part of the chaos and confusion as the economy grows during this time period. Anyway, as we lay down the railroad lines, we're also going to use this new invention called the telegraph. The telegraph is essentially a really, really slow version of texting. It's an electrified line, and you're able to tap through this thing called Morse code on this line, and that is going to allow for relatively fast communication. By the end of this chapter, and again, this chapter isn't really set in time, but think of it this way. By the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is able to communicate with a lot of regions of the country relatively instantaneously. It's not like it is today, but it's significantly faster than anything we've had before, and those telegraph lines are going to follow the railroads. Now, this as these changes are happening in America, we're going to have this new word, and we may have used it before, but in case we haven't, let's talk about it right now. It's called sectionalism, and what it basically means is that the country is developing differently, kind of like in chunks. So sectionalism means that there is a difference in how regions of the country are politically, socially, and economically working. So let's think of it this way. In the North has a lot of businesses and tariffs and product development and production. That's what they do in the North. They make stuff. Whereas in the South is more focused on, well, plantation-based agriculture. The way I like to think about this is the North is changing and progressing, and the South basically isn't. So this is going to lead to a change in what America is going to be. What is America? Are we a nation of businesses and factories, or are we a nation of slaves? And that is really the debate. In fact, that's actually the crux of what the Civil War is about. We're going to talk about this a lot more later, but like this is kind of the start of the question. The Civil War isn't necessarily about slavery itself. It's actually about this question here. What is America? Are we a nation of factory workers or a nation of plantation-based agriculture? And the reason why I'm talking about it now, even though we're years away from the Civil War in class, is because this is kind of actually where it starts. When historians look at the origins of the Civil War, they go all the way back to 1812, because that's really where it starts. In fact, it starts even earlier. But it starts about this debate because what really causes the Civil War is as America is moving westward into the Great Plains, up until the Rocky Mountains, the question is what culture, what economy is going to move westward? Is slavery and plantation-based Southern agriculture, which has looked the exact same for 250 years, is that going to move westward? Or is this progress in industry of the North going to move westward? What is America going to be? The fight over that is what the Civil War is about. Yes, slavery is very heavily involved, but there's more to the Civil War than slavery. And it really comes down to this question, which is being introduced in this chapter. And here comes a fancy SAT word. These issues are going to be exacerbated by infrastructure developments. When America acquires all this territory, there's like, we don't have to worry about slavery because it's, we're moving westward so slowly and culture develops so slowly, we don't have to worry. Slavery will just fizzle out on its own. That's what Thomas Jefferson believed. But now that we have this technology and we can communicate almost instantly, and we have railroads and canals and we can move people faster, suddenly that question of, oh, we can wait 100 years for slavery to get solved. No, we can't. It's a problem now. Okay, so there's also some early inventions that your textbook tends to talk about and the AP exam tends to bring up every now and then. So let's just mention them so you know what they are. The first one is going to be the cotton gin made by this dude named Eli Whitney. Ironically, cotton development was actually going downwards in America in the 1790s, hence why the founding fathers kind of thought slavery was going to die out, because cotton production was not really all that profitable, even with slaves. It isn't until Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin that makes it easy to separate cotton from the cotton seeds. And this is actually going to allow cotton to be mass produced at a significantly larger scale. So ironically, it's this invention that is going to make slavery expand. Eli Whitney, technically, he said he invented this to actually get rid of slavery, but it actually made it grow because now cotton was significantly easier to produce. John Deere, yes, the tractor guy, he comes up with a steel tip plow, which makes it easier to plow fields. That's kind of nice. Cyrus McCormick comes up with a mechanical reaper, which makes it easier to actually harvest crops. That's nice too. Again, these are the early starts of agricultural, which leads to industrial development. I don't know why your textbook talks about it here, but it does. Now you know what they are. Let's move on. The one that comes up a lot is the cotton gins. Just know that one. Okay, so now we're progressing a little bit further into the chapter. The question now we have to ask ourselves is, what does work look like now, and how is that going to affect society? So if you go back to the summer lecture, American society is kind of based off of every family needing to farm their own food. Like, our Constitution is actually based off of this idea. Early in the American Republic, the government only worked like 3 months out of the year because they'd spend the remaining 9 months of the year going home and being a farmer. John Adams, the second president of the United States, he was a lawyer, but he was also a farmer because he had to be. So he would do all of his presidential stuff, then he would go home to Braintree, Massachusetts, and he would sit there and farm for 9 months, and then he would come back. So imagine insert current president here. Again, I recorded this in 2025. Imagine President Trump having to not work for 9 months because he had to take care of a farm. Now that seems insane, right? But that's how it was. As society is changing because of the need for fewer people to be farming, the question is, what does that mean for what we are as a society? What is work going to look like now? And what are people going to do with their more free time? Remember, farming's like a 24/7, 365 job. If that's not needed anymore, what do people do? And that's kind of what this chapter is going to talk a little bit about. So we'll start by talking about what is work. During this time period, we're going to have something known as the factory system. So the factory system was started by a dude named Samuel Slater. And the basic idea of a factory system is that people are going to be working in a giant room with a bunch of machines producing some sort of supply. Typically that supply is a textile. Especially in the North is mainly producing clothing. Historical side note, excuse me, producing clothing based off of Southern cotton. So it's easy to blame the South for the Civil War and slavery and stuff like that, but the North is buying most of that cotton to make t-shirts. Anyway, so the factory system is this idea that you are going to go into a building and your life is now going to be managed by a clock. The clock says it's 6 o'clock in the morning, time to go to work, and then you work until that clock says 8 p.m. Yeah, they worked about 14 hours a day. You might get a lunch break, and you might be 6 years old, by the way. You're assuming that this is something only adults do, but that is not true. Children are going to be working a lot during this time period. When every American was a farmer, your life was determined by the farm, and your day was determined by the farm and by the seasons. That doesn't matter anymore because you're working inside of a building. You don't necessarily get weekends. You don't necessarily get, oh, it's raining, can't farm today because it's raining. That was a thing on farms, but it don't matter if it rains, we still go to school, right? The factory system really changes what the average American's day and work looks like. It also has another interesting question. Sorry, I'm coughing all of a sudden. Another interesting question here is, what do people do when they're not farming? God forbid you actually get a day off from work. What does that mean? There's no such thing as a day off when you're a farmer. Those cows got to get fed every day. But if you don't need to do that, what do you do on a day that you're not actually working? And we're actually going to kind of answer that question in later chapters. It leads to this thing called entertainment, which leads to these people called celebrities. Gross. But that's a later chapter. Now, who's going to do all of this unskilled labor in the North? So we've talked a little bit before about America's need for labor. Well, now the North has a need for labor. Who's going to do all of this unskilled labor in the North? Well, this is going to be the first of several waves of immigration into America. As there is a need for industrialized labor, the question is who's going to do it? And it turns out that America has more jobs than we have people at this time period. And I'm specifically talking about the North, because the South never really industrializes, so they don't matter. Instead, we're going to talk about the North. Now, the question here is, what does labor look like? So there are two types of labor in America. The first type is skilled labor. Think of skilled labor like a skilled artisan. A skilled artisan could make a shoe by his or herself, make this shoe entirely on their own, and they could make a beautiful shoe, but it's probably going to take them over a month to make one pair of shoes. They could do the entire process from start to finish, but it's going to take them a month, right? That's skilled labor. Now, with the advent of factories, this is going to change into something known as unskilled labor. Factory work means that we're going to take a large, difficult thing to make, like a shoe, and we're going to break it down into component parts. Before, it took a skilled artisan to know all of the things you had to know about making a shoe. But in a factory, if I can use a machine, rather than have one employee make the entire shoe themselves, I'm going to break this up, making a shoe, into 50 parts. I'm going to hire 50 employees, and I'm going to teach each one of them to do that one thing. And all day, all you're going to do is step 1 or step 17 of 50. And you just do that one step. By the end of the day, using 50 workers, unskilled workers, we're able to make 1,000 shoes a day. This is the difference between skilled versus unskilled labor. Now, the problem here is that while, yes, you can make more shoes, this is actually going to severely devalue work. What I mean by that is, if you're an unskilled laborer, your work is not necessarily as valuable. I'm not saying it's not difficult. In fact, unskilled laborers in America work way harder than skilled laborers do. Don't believe me? Watch people that do gardening. That's considered unskilled labor. Those people work insanely hard and they are insanely talented at what they do, but that's considered unskilled labor. So that doesn't mean that like unskilled labor is easy or they don't deserve compensation. But what happens in America though is there becomes this philosophy of, okay, well, if you're an unskilled laborer, that means you're easily replaced. And because you're easily replaced, then there's going to be less of a desire to pay people well. So as America industrializes and starts working, workers are really not going to be paid as much as they would expect. We're essentially going to reduce the amount of pay that workers are going to be getting. Because again, if you're an unskilled laborer, you're technically easily replaceable. Okay, I do step 17 of 50. Okay, well, I could teach anyone in about 3 minutes to do step 17. And there's a guy outside that'll do it for 5 cents an hour and you want 10. Why would I pay you 10? That dude will do it for 5. It's the same labor. And this is what work is going to start looking like in America, really for the next 75 to 80 years. What also makes things a little bit more complicated is that we're going to have this rise of immigrants. We're going to have more immigrants coming to America, and immigrants typically are more willing to do labor for a lower cost. Immigrants that come to America are typically less likely to be skilled, especially as we progress through the 1800s and 1900s. We're getting fewer and fewer skilled laborers, and we're getting more unskilled laborers. So, as a factory owner, if I can get this Irish immigrant to do the same work as an American, but do it for cheaper, why would I hire the American? And this is going to become a pretty big problem as the 1800s progress. Because it turns out that if I can hire an Irish person to do the work of an American citizen for cheaper, why would I hire them? Well, what happens here is that, and you can pretty much logically figure this out, the American laborer is going to start hating Irish people. We live in a current state of America where there's this long-standing discussion of not liking immigrants. And the thing is, if you study US history, that's not anything new. Pretty much every generation of Americans has not liked the next incoming group of immigrants. So the anti-immigrant fervor that may exist in whatever year you're watching this, it's existed every year of my life. It's also existed every year of US history. The thing is, the hated immigrant group is always different. So in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, it's going to be Eastern Europeans. In the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, it's going to be Eastern Europeans again and the Irish. Then it's going to be Asian immigrants, and then fast forward to like 1930, 40, and 50, it's going to start being Latino immigrants. Then it goes back to being Asian immigrants again, and then it goes back to being Latino immigrants. The thing is, the anger is never really different. And the big reason why there's going to be this anger is because a couple things. Well, one, there's the labor issue, more specifically the pay for labor issue that we just discussed. The other reason why we have the rise of this thing known as nativism, and by the way, nativism means not liking immigrants. The second reason why there's going to be this thing known as nativism is that what happens if an immigrant group doesn't want to join the dominant culture? Okay, so this is a little complicated, but what happens if the immigrant group doesn't want to assimilate? So the first people that came to America were trying to leave the British Empire, especially once we declare independence, and they wanted to be part of this American experiment. But as we progress through the 1800s and 1900s, people are coming to America not necessarily because they want to be American. They want to be for example, an Irish person living in America. They don't want to be an American. They want to be an Irish person in America. Perhaps you've heard of towns like Little Tokyo or Little Italy or Chinatown, these conclaves where that's on American soil, but the people that are living there are still basically trying to recreate wherever they came from. This is actually a thing that's going to cause a lot of anger among Americans that have already come here. This idea of you want to come to America and take advantage of America's opportunities, but you don't want to join the dominant culture. You don't want to assimilate and become like other people that are here. And that anger is part of what's known as nativism, right? This has existed all throughout US history. And in fact, whenever you see a rise of immigration in America, there is always a rise of nativism. And those are pretty much the biggest reasons why it happens. Again, to recap, immigrants are typically more likely to work for a lower wage. They're more often unskilled labor, and they're going to work for a lower wage. So this takes money away from current American citizens. And two, the newer immigrant groups are going to be less likely to want to assimilate into the dominant culture. They're not really going to want to become an American. They want to be a whatever they were living in America. And this is also going to make people be kind of frustrated. A good way that you can see this is that a lot of people might be anti-immigrant until they learn that that person wants to become a citizen. And then there's usually an immediate change in their demeanor. Oh, wow, that's so cool. I've helped several people become citizens. And whenever I say that to someone, they're like, oh, that is so cool that that person wants to be part of America, right? So how do we go from not liking immigrants to being okay with them? Once the immigrant class wants to assimilate, nativism tends to go away. So again, that's kind of a little bit outside of this chapter, but that just kind of helps you guys get a better understanding of what's going on here. Okay, moving on. Okay, every teacher gets to decide if there's something that they don't feel like teaching. So I'm not going to teach this. It's not hard. It's in your book. The thing is, transcendentalism is more of a this is an English teacher thing to teach. It's a lot of literature stuff, and that to me is more English teachers. So I'm going to allow your English teacher to teach this better than I will. So give it a read through. I know you talk about it in your English class. So there you go. You can do that. Okay, let's continue our discussion of culture, though. So we talked about the economy. Now let's talk about culture. During this time period, we're going to have a growth in popular religion. We end up having something known as the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening is a religious revival that is going to occur in America post-War of 1812. What starts to happen is that religion is going to grow for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons why religion grows is because, okay, we don't necessarily have scarcity anymore in America. And what I mean by that is that we're not subsistence farming anymore. We're starting to become a nation that has more things and more stuff, and people aren't starving anymore. So with that being said, shouldn't there be shouldn't we try to be more intentional and more moral in how we live? If we're capable of doing it, and we are, shouldn't there be this intention of living better, living more religiously or morally? If we can, we probably should. So that's going to become a dominant thing. There's also going to be this growth of the Second Great Awakening because of we're looking at what happens when the government doesn't exist. So as Americans are moving westward, religion becomes more and more popular because a good substitute for government protecting natural rights is going to be religion protecting natural rights. If you boil down the religious doctrines of pretty much every major religion, and just to make it simple, we'll talk about the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments basically say, don't kill each other, don't be jealous of each other's stuff, and don't take each other's stuff. Well, to me, that sounds like life, liberty, and property should be protected, yeah? Well, that's kind of going to be the basis of, as America moves westward, and there is no government there, because it hasn't moved with the Americans yet, religion is going to be a good substitute for government when it comes to protecting natural rights. So this is going to be part of why we have a Second Great Awakening and we have a religious revival in America. Basically, all walks of life are going to be involved in this religious revival. So it's not just focused in one area, and it's not just focused on one group. It's really going to be everyone in America becomes more religious during this time period. So let's take a look at a couple of religions. The most common religion that the AP exam likes to talk about is going to be Mormonism. Mormonism is a great example of the importance of the West in America and westward movement. The reason why the College Board likes asking about the Mormon story is because it's a story of the Second Great Awakening and it's a story of westward expansion put together. So they could ask you about any of those things. They could ask you about westward expansion, they could ask you about the growth of religions, and they could ask you about this growth of American importance. Now, this class and the AP exam is not really going to ask you about any of the particular beliefs of Mormons, so we're not going to get into that here. But the basic idea here is that Mormonism is a branch of Christianity, and it's going to kind of center the United States into the biblical story. And again, that's a gross oversimplification. I apologize if anyone is Mormon and that doesn't sound like a good summary of your religion. I apologize. But again, it's a basic, that's why it's popular in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. That's why it becomes popular in the Second Great Awakening. The problem here is that there's several of them, but Mormons are going to be, they're going to kind of challenge the dominant religious ethic of America. And they're also going to challenge the power and political hierarchies of several American states, which is why Mormons are going to be forced to move westward. Essentially, Mormons are going to be kicked out of every town they start in. So Joseph Smith is going to be the founder of this religion, and he starts his religion in New York, in upstate New York, and becomes pretty popular pretty quickly. However, while people like Mormonism, the political and other religious groups are not necessarily as interested or psyched in them. So he's going to be kicked out of New York and move his people westward. He makes it, and again, I'm kind of summarizing the story. He ends up making it to Illinois, I believe, and eventually is going to be captured by an angry mob and killed. So the next leader of Mormonism, this dude named Brigham Young, is going to take the Mormon people all the way, basically on the outskirts of America. He's going to send them to this place called Utah, and they're going to develop their utopian community essentially in Utah, very far away from the American government. Interesting side note about Utah is that there are lots of Mormons that go to Utah. There are lots of people in Utah, but the US government kind of ignores Utah as a state. Utah should have become a state significantly earlier than it does. However, it's not accepted as a state until the late 1800s, like 50 years after Utah was settled, mainly because there's this like distrust among the American government of the Mormon religion and the Mormon people. But again, that's outside of the purview of this class. It is just kind of interesting though. So there you go. There's a story of Mormons, a brief summary. Again, I apologize if this was not in-depth or thorough enough, or if I got a detail wrong. But gotta kind of summarize stuff. Now, there's going to be some more utopian communities, and I realize now that I have to be careful about how I talk about this, or else YouTube might take this video down. They might anyway. So there becomes this utopian community ideal during this time period. The basic idea here is that because we live in a post-scarcity kind of society, we should try to live more moral. I talked about that in a previous slide. Well, utopian communities are going to be like, what if we made heaven on earth, right? We don't need to wait to die to get to heaven. We can make it here. We have the capability of making pretty much anything and producing enough food. So what if we tried to live in a utopian world now? There's going to be two major groups that your book is going to talk about, known as the Shakers and the Oneida Colony. I'm not going to talk about them here because I'm afraid that YouTube might take them down. So feel free to read about them. It's relatively easy. Okay, well, now that we are talking about a war on, or changing culture, what if we start getting rid of some of the cultural ills of America? So for example, if we are trying to live more religiously, shouldn't we also live more moral? Shouldn't we try to solve some of the moral problems in America? The first one we're going to look at is going to be this concept known as temperance. Temperance means to limit the consumption of alcohol. So we've talked before about the necessity of alcohol in early America. The problem here is that, of course, people are going to over-consume alcohol, and then they're going to, well, not go to work. They're going to be drinking all day. There might be, I don't know, spousal abuse issues that happen. Again, I'm trying to keep this vague so I don't get this video taken down. So if we're trying to live more religiously, as America is becoming more religious, shouldn't we like, cut back on alcohol, especially when it leads to things that are not necessarily seen as ideal? Well, that's temperance. The American Temperance Society is going to try to limit consumption of alcohol across the United States. And they're going to be actually pretty successful in limiting alcohol consumption. Again, this does not mean to make alcohol illegal. That's coming later. The goal of temperance is to limit alcohol consumption. Hey, historical side note, this movement and the other movements we're going to talk about are going to be predominantly led by women. Why do you think it is that social issues are led by women? I'll let you pause for a second to contemplate. The answer is, among several answers, is that women's role in society is going to be more predicated on religion. So women are seen as being important when it comes to religious and moral behavior in America anyway. That's kind of their accepted social role. But on top of that, because women can't vote, how are they going to affect the world around them? Well, they're going to affect the things that they're culturally allowed to care about. So women are culturally allowed to care about religion and care about moral issues. So that's what they're going to be doing during this time period. That's what women are going to use to exercise their rights when they don't have the right to vote. Next, what do we do about the issues when it comes to people that are mentally handicapped or people that are like criminally insane? So during this time period, there's going to become this idea thought up by this woman named Dorothea Dix, who says that we should take people that are maladjusted, in whatever way you want to define that, and send them into like rehab facilities known as penitentiaries. So we take people that have mental health issues, that have whatever types of issues like that, and we send them to a place where they can be kind of kept away from society, but also rehabilitated. That's going to be the idea of penitentiaries. So it's not just a place to like send criminals so they're out of everyone's way. It's also going to be a place where they can be rehabilitated to perhaps re-enter society when whatever malady they have has been, addressed in whatever way. Okay, let's talk about the person that you hate more than anyone else. His name is Horace Mann. Why do you hate him? Well, Horace Mann is going to come up with basically the idea of public education. So maybe, just maybe, we don't need child labor as much anymore. Now, hold on. Businesses are still going to want child labor. However, a lot of families are going to say, maybe we could make a better world if we don't force children into factories and instead we force them to go into a building where they're required to learn stuff. Horace Mann basically comes up with the idea of public schools. This thought process of being, well, what if we send children to a place where they could learn to read? They could learn about the history of this country. They could learn how to do math. And they could learn how to fit into this society that we want to create. And if you think about it, that's kind of what school has kind of done, right? Look around you. I mean, again, you're probably at home, but next time you're in class, look around. And everyone around you is going to be different, but they're all kind of learning the same things, right? It turns out that there is a deeper value to school beyond just having a place to shove kids for a couple hours a day. It's going to be a place where we can actually make American citizens. And this goes back to that issue of immigration. So if we're going to have a bunch of people that are immigrating into America, how do we make it so they learn all the same cultural norms that everyone else does? How do we make it so that way a kid in Alabama is going to have the same understanding of America as a kid from New York? How are we going to get an immigrant from Russia to understand American values? Put them in school. And they're all going to be taught at the same time by a teacher. They're going to learn the basics of like respecting authority figures by respecting the teacher. They're going to learn a similar language, similar math, similar history, and they're also maybe going to learn about the history of the country. And maybe we'll also have them like, I don't know, pledge allegiance to a flag and learn national anthems and hymns and stuff like that. That is assimilation. And really, that's the real idea as to why schools come around. This idea of, we should basically make Americans in school, and every American goes to school. And that's why every American has an opinion on what school is and what it should be. Horseman, he's the villain of your story. Hey, while we're here, if we're trying to live a better, more moral life, maybe we should do something about that whole slavery issue. Right, slavery. Maybe we should talk about that. It's not that the abolition movement, and abolition, of course, means to get rid of slavery. It's not that the anti-slavery mantra is going to start in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. There's been people that were against slavery from the beginning of American history, but specifically, of course, the slaves. But the anti-slavery movement's going to grow during this time period. So let's talk about a couple of ways that it happens. The first way that it happens is there's going to be this group that's formed called the American Colonization Society. And that name sounds really good. And I said they're abolitionists, so you're assuming that's really positive. It's not. The American Colonization Society, their idea to solve the slavery issue is to basically just send every black person back to Africa. So that's not, ideal. So again, when you see abolition, you're assuming that means that every abolitionist is like, I don't know, pro-equality, and that's not always the case. The American Colonization Society wants to basically get rid of all black people in the country. So that's that. Another abolition movement during this time period is going to be led by William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, pictured there with a giant forehead, he's going to be a newspaper writer and a newspaper editor. He owns a newspaper called The Liberator. And The Liberator is one of the most widely distributed newspapers in America. It's one of the most widely read newspapers in America during this time period. And he's going to publish a lot of essays saying that slavery is morally wrong. And as America is going through this second great awakening, how can we justify being more religious while we're keeping like 12% of the US population enslaved? So how can we say that we are religious and moral and then enslave people? And he's going to release hundreds of essays, and he's going to publish a bunch of slave narratives basically saying that slavery is wrong. And this movement is going to be growing and growing more in America, especially in the North. And this is going to be part of this separation and anger that's going to lead to the Civil War. Now, there's going to be some slave narratives. We'll discuss more of them later. You're going to read excerpts in this class and your English class. But there's going to be some other books that are published during this time period that talk about what the life of a slave really is like. Frederick Douglass writes several autobiographies about his life as a slave. And Solomon Northup is going to write a book called 12 Years a Slave, which to me is actually one of, I think, the most powerful slave narratives, mainly because Solomon Northup is a free man in the North, and he's going to be captured by slave traders and sent to the South. And he's going to be forced to live as a slave, even though he was a free man. So it's a pretty crazy story, and it's true, and it's horrifying. And when these two books are published, the American public starts to learn just how awful slavery is. The best thing you can say about people in the North is that while they may have known that slavery existed, they didn't know what it was. Kind of like how you guys might not know about how your iPhone is produced. Side note, it's by slaves. They're just in Asia. You guys might not be aware of that. And it doesn't mean that you're a horrible or a bad person. You just don't know what it really is. So when you are exposed to the information as to how cell phones or how chocolate and coffee are produced, all by slaves, once you learn about that, you might become more aware about the issues and say, maybe we need to find a way to produce cell phones, chocolate, and coffee, not based off of child slave labor. That would be kind of nice. And that's essentially what's going to happen here in the North, is that these books by these former slaves are going to kind of expose the atrocities and horrors of slavery to the American public. That being said, while those two slave narratives are super important to the story of doing that, the most popular book in America during this time period about slavery is going to be written by a white woman. Her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she basically makes up a story of what she thinks slavery is like. And this becomes the most widely published book about slavery in America. You know, not the two first-hand accounts on what slavery is, but essentially a middle-class white woman making a story up of what she assumes it's like. And that's Uncle Tom's Cabin. That book is the one that becomes, again, a dominant force in this growing movement that maybe we should get rid of slavery. Okay, last thing, these next three slides all go together and they're relatively quick. So there's going to become this concern about like, what do we do with women, specifically women's labor, when we no longer need women working on the farm? If you remember, farm labor was divided. One person was working in the home, taking care of home issues, and then one person was 25 feet away working on the farm, right? This is kind of a co-equal partnership when you're a subsistence farmer. One person's got to take care of the kids, one person's got to take care of the cows and chickens, right? You are equal partners in this relationship. What starts to happen during this time period, though, is that now that we have fewer and fewer subsistence farmers, and we're basically going to encourage men to work in factories, and maybe only a few women and children, what do women do? What is their role in society? And the answer to this question is going to be they don't. They don't do anything. And what I mean by that is that women are essentially going to be kind of stuck in the home as men are going to leave. We call this the cult of domesticity. This idea that a woman's role is to be in the home and a man's role is to be outside the home at work. So women are not going to be a co-equal partner anymore. Instead, women are going to be kind of stuck in the home as like a cultural hostage, while men are going to be the movers, doers, and shakers of society. We're going to read an excerpt in class that goes into this in more detail, so make sure you read that. If you weren't in class that day, make sure you read it. If not, we'll read it together and we'll go into a better definition. Now, the problem here for women is that common law is going to prohibit women from inheriting property, signing contracts, serving on a jury, and of course, voting in elections. So women are going to be basically have no political power in America whatsoever. On top of that, women also have no economic power. Women's prospects in employment are going to be dim. They are only allowed to work in a few service-related jobs, and most were paid about half, if not like 10 cents on the dollar to what a man would make. So there's going to be this basic disrespecting of female labor and female work, and this idea that women should stay in the home, and the outside of the home is for men and men only. Now, historical side note, because women couldn't inherit or own property, it was actually very common during the 1800s in America. If your husband died, ladies, you would immediately have to get remarried. Because if you didn't, you could lose the land that you were living on, even though it was your property too. It wasn't seen that way legally. There's a lot of famous stories in America that on Monday you'd have a funeral and you'd use the leftovers Tuesday at your wedding day to a new guy. Imagine that being your life, ladies. That's what it was like. So obviously, you're going to assume that some women are going to be kind of, upset about this. So what is that movement? This is going to lead to a women's rights meeting known as Seneca Falls. It's led by several women. No, a couple of them are Lucretia Mott, my girl, Susan B. Anthony, and the queen of them all, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They're going to begin to speak out on temperance, abolition, but mainly the focus is going to be women's rights. The idea here is that women should have more rights in society. As we're giving more rights to men, we should be giving more rights to women as well. And they're going to be pushing mainly for women's suffrage. Suffrage, of course, means to vote. And that's going to become kind of the end point of the Second Great Awakening and the end point of our story. Now, unfortunately for Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they're not going to live to see their dream come to fruition. Sorry, my dog is snoring. That's what you just heard. I know, you hate history. It's okay. So, my dog is Maltese, so she's a Maltese. So, Gidgy, wake up, little one. She only cares about Malta's history. Now, unfortunately for these women, they're not going to live to see this. And the reason why we use 1848 as kind of the endpoint of this chapter and the endpoint of this Second Great Awakening story is because we're going to be distracted by a couple of other things in America, and women's rights and cultural improvement issues are going to be put by the wayside because, we got to get to the Civil War. The Civil War doesn't start in 1848, but a lot of things in America change that year that precipitate the Civil War. But that's the story for a later chapter. Thanks for listening. I hope you guys learned something, and I don't know, test tomorrow. Bye.